I was born in Alexandria, Egypt, to Greek parents. I went to an English school, and then I went to university in England. Got my PhD in pharmacology. But I specialized in hormones and how the brain regulates the stress response. So because of that background, I was recruited by NASA in its very early days, because I figured that someone sitting on top of a rocket has to be stressed.
Yeah.
I went to NASA in 1964 as a NRC, National Academy of Sciences, postdoctoral fellow. And 2 years after that, I was hired by NASA.
So you've been part of NASA since its beginning. I mean,
Almost, yes.
At least the manned flight.
Absolutely, and that was the fun of it. You know, first of all, my colleagues at university thought I was crazy. Leave a perfectly good career in academia and research to go and do what? Space. Good heavens! I mean, gravity. Oh, what is it? It was, it's all around us. So what's the big deal? And but it was an interesting environment. Of course, it's very seductive. I laugh every time we get a new administrator in NASA. They come in, they're going to make changes, and they're going to do this. And 3 months later, they're there at launch, just as gaga as anybody else. It's wonderful. It's very seductive.
That's great.
What was interesting is that in Gemini 7, which was the first time we could actually collect samples and analyze anything, it was a 14-day mission. Both Borman and Lovell, neither of them showed any increased stress. In fact, it was below pre-flight and post-flight levels.
Oh, wow.
And there were all kinds of explanations given that it wasn't measured right, but steroids are very steady, stable things to measure, so that was not the case. And then before and after they were high, so it wasn't. It was in the same people, the same techniques, so that was not the answer. But from Skylab on, it was clear that astronauts showed increased stress activities. And my feeling is that those first 7 astronauts that came from Korea and saw military action, this was a joyride. Why should you get stressed? Is the dream come true? Whereas the later ones, who shuttle astronauts and now the station astronauts, are there's evidence now from a reactivation of viruses. Like one astronaut came down with shingles 2 days before flight. And that tells you that it's not space, it's the circumstances that surround space that are stressful. So it's a different breed, because these kids don't have the experience that Borman and Lovell and Glenn and Shepard had. So that's how I got into space to begin with, and human space specifically. And I've always been interested in human research, so we had to find some way of mimicking the effects of being without gravity, more or less. And the Germans first, and then the Russians, and then we adopted the model of lying in bed as the closest to inducing the kinds of changes you see in space. And then the Russians came up with an even better model, because when their cosmonauts returned from space, especially after the longer missions, they complained that when they couldn't get a good night's sleep, they desperately wanted to get a good night's sleep after coming back, and they just couldn't get to sleep because they felt as if they were slipping off the end of the bed. Unless and until they could raise the foot of the bed with phone books or something, and to a point where it felt horizontal. And so the Russian scientists thought, well, being head down must be closer to what it feels like to be in space. And therefore they tried that to to mimic the effects of spaceflight, and indeed they are much closer. So we used that. I imported the model and used that for research of all kinds to understand exactly what happens in a more invasive way than you can do with astronauts, or you would want to do with astronauts, or they would let you do. Oh, I think it's first of all, it's inevitable in our search for ourselves and our universe and our world that we live in, and our curiosity. I mean, why do we look beyond the horizon? Why do we go over a mountain, climb a mountain? Why would we dive in the ocean? It's inevitable that we will search to see what's around the corner, and that's exploring. And so it will continue. It has to continue. How we do it and what's the most, what is the justification for doing it, other than the emotional and the destiny kind of approach, which is a perfectly good excuse anyway. There are lots and lots of reasons, and the discovery, I think, from my perspective, of how gravity affects us here on Earth, how we have no idea until we get away from it. Like anything else, if you want to find out how light works on the human body, you have to turn the lights out. So the same way, and obviously you can't get away from gravity completely. You can reduce its effectiveness, but you can't get away from it until you go out in space. And that's why we will always have a problem with magnetic fields, which is the other force of the universe, because you cannot completely shield from magnetic fields on Earth. So one day it'll happen too, but right now we can't do that, and we have no idea. But just like gravity, I'm sure the effect is profound. There are three aspects to having a human in space. And unfortunately, the program has not been organized around those three variables. One is gravity, obviously. The other is radiation, which is seen as a negative, but we don't know. And the third is the environment. And by the environment, what I mean is the capsule, the spacecraft, which is a mini Earth to sustain life. Like Jim Bajan, the astronaut, said once, and I took it away. What I want to know first is that I can breathe. Forget the rest. I want to know that I can breathe. It's perfectly logical. Forget all the other fancy stuff. Basics. And so the environment that we have created for the human is very tricky to control, but we've managed generally to do a very good job. Now, we can't sustain it, because we don't have long-term batteries and all that sort of stuff. And so the life support system and the human factors, the interactions with the other astronauts and isolation, and the fact that you can't mimic that on the ground because you put them in a capsule or in a thing and they can walk out. Whereas there, you can't go for a walk. You can go for a spacewalk, but again, not quite the same. And so, And the life support system, to me, is extremely important because, and we haven't used it for earth sciences, because earth sciences observes changes in the environment, in the climate, in the ozone hole, in the water, in the acid rain, or whatever, but ice. But we cannot make it change. To study how changing one little variable, what impact it will have. Well, I think you can use a space life support system with a human in it and change each variable and look at the effect. And the reason I say that is because we did, at one time, there was a leak in the life support system and there was an increase in carbon dioxide in the capsule. Very small, but we were worried that might have an effect on the astronauts. So we did a study. In fact, we did it in Germany, with German colleagues in a chamber. And everyone said, oh, but this is below threshold. And so we used several levels of CO2 in the chamber, at threshold, slightly above, to mimic what was in the shuttle, and another level. And sure enough, 24 hours later, there were no acid-base changes in the astronauts' criteria. 3 days later, there was a cumulative effect of this non-significant carbon dioxide level. After 3 days, increased the acidity of the blood. So when we do these studies and monitor and say, oh, well, it's okay, it's below level, whatever, we don't know what the cumulative effect of an infinitesimal amount over a long period of time might have. So I think that's an example of how a system like that can be used to study levels that are below what are considered toxic or have an impact or whatever, either in the atmosphere or in the water or in any kind of environmental. I mean, there's no doubt. I don't know about earth sciences, except that I do know that we humans dump a lot of stuff. And, you can't get away from that. So to the extent that you could say, well, you dump, but it has no effect. Well, maybe not in one day, but if you do it, yeah. The other example was with iodine, because we used to sterilize the water in the spacecraft with iodine. The Russians used silver nitrate. We used iodine for reasons I never quite figured out because, well, we did a ground study about 10 years ago for a life support system that could be for a space, for exploration, because we were looking at exploration then. And so we gave them the water system that they had on shuttle. We had to terminate the study. The study was going to be 30 days. I mean, this was on the ground chamber. They were just recycling the water and had plants and things, goodies in there. We had to terminate because the levels of iodine became toxic. So, I mean, if we had that on station, we'd be in real trouble. I mean, we weren't doing it for station. We were doing it for beyond, and just never quite thought that level would be cumulative. Wow. So you have things like that we've learned from practical things from space that there's. You can say, well, they're not very significant, but yes, they are.
Right. Yeah.
In the scheme of environmental health, and the technology is huge. I mean, the sensors we had to develop to monitor the environment continuously have had applications that they've been done at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Mostly, we developed the electronic nose
That's good.
It's a little chip, that monitors everything. I mean, absolutely everything. So, lots and lots of technology, just fantastic. I think if we take Moon separate from Mars, it'd be interesting to see whether the threshold for gravity requirement is below level. It would appear to be below or just about at threshold level on the Moon, because they still stood upright, more or less. They hopped, but they were upright. Whereas you would expect, there was a direction, let's put it that way. It's also the combination of whatever gravity there is with the weight of the life support system, the backpack and the suit. So it's the combination of the load on the body. So it would take relatively little, I would imagine, to get it right on the Moon from that perspective, as opposed to Mars. Mars is a different issue. It's less. You have to do something else. I think the dust on the Moon is a problem, and the kind of suit that's developed cannot be what we have now. You have to develop a completely new concept of a suit. Now, there's been some work at MIT, David Newman, working on the principle of that the suit has to be flexible, non-custom, so that and patchable, because obviously you're going to tear it at some point, the way it is now. And the kinds of suits she has developed is using different kinds of materials, more like a scuba diving suit. I think that's brilliant, but we have a reluctance to make a leap. It's not going to happen tomorrow, so, The other aspect of this elasticized is that it probably, it can exert compression, alternating compression. And they found that seems to maintain muscle and bone, or at least help to maintain muscle and bone. So we can do double duty, which is what we have. We move around, and the muscle pulls on the bone and retains the architecture of the bone. So you couple that with a basic gravity threshold, and you're in business. So that's an example of the sort of thing. I don't think the human factors aspect will be nearly as bad, because you can see Earth as long as you can see Earth. Now, if you're on the dark side of the Moon, that's a different issue. And I think I believe, and certainly the reports from Al Warden and Mitchell and others who circled the Moon, the sensation of loss and separation they felt on the other side of the Moon. It was very, very strong from their reports. Some have gone religious or quasi-religious or psycho, whatever Mitchell went into. And I'm not saying that it was because of that. I mean, sure. In other words, your faith has to carry you through, and it better be strong, because that separation of not being able to see the Earth and the link was strong, which is an interesting observation. From different perspective, you can get out of the habitat, which I presume you would have a habitat, and move around, which would be exciting. So I think from that point of view that there wouldn't be any serious problems. We'll probably find others, I have no idea. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of things we haven't even thought of. Not to mention the resources that might be there, and the energy that you can pipe back, and harness the minerals or whatever else you find on there. And if indeed you can find some sort of water, not the water that they're talking about now, but other ways.
Yeah.
Regeneration with plants, you can get water, you can get all kinds of things.
Any unique opportunities or challenges with Mars?
Mars is a completely different issue. You still have the dust. Radiation would be the issue. It would be on the moon too, but on Mars, radiation and radiation shielding. But if we're not going to go to Mars tomorrow, and I cannot believe with the materials and the research in materials that is going on and the advances in materials that we cannot find something that is lightweight. I mean, we know polyethylene, for instance, shields. Well, we've got to work on it.
Yeah.
Maybe we can't go with lead skirts or it just isn't. But the thing with Mars is that you need to start seriously research now. They're long lead items. You can't just say, okay, I've got you can't say anymore, I've got the rocket, I've got the capsule, I've got the habitat. Now we'll put man in it and let's go. I mean, that has stopped. I think we've reached a point where we can't do that anymore and expect the human to survive. Now, I've had people tell me they'd go one way to Mars. Good luck to them, because that's entirely a leap of faith. But I think we need to do proper research to get rid of these serious variable threats. Because I think if we had a good shielding system or a spacesuit that had a shielding component in it and a habitat that could be well shielded and protected, safe haven, and safe havens that can be dropped around Mars. There's no reason we can't do that ahead of time. We have to figure out where we land. So in the process of figuring out, we had an experiment on one of the Mars proposed for one of the Mars missions, robotic missions, that would send a spray of sensors all over the Mars surface so that we could map the radiation around Mars and just use that in addition to terrain for landing. But I don't think it ever went. But it's the sort of thing that we need to do if we're serious. And that should just piggyback, and it's nothing. I mean, you can go with Ariane or something, and just get tossed over.
Right.
So we need to have where to land, the radiation mapped. If there is water, go near water. Somewhere where we can dig a habitat underground for protection, at least protected. And then figure out how the oxygen and the oxidation component of the atmosphere on Mars would affect components of the habitat and the spacecraft and the suit and of course the human. See, because you'd have to live in a spacesuit, at least with current thinking, short of something else. You'd have to live in it. That's not a very nice way of living. Because again, you'd want to explore. That's what you're there for, right?
Yeah.
It could get pretty boring if you didn't. This has to be done ahead of time. We need a reliable regenerating life support system. We do not have that on space station. It's a basic thing that you need to develop, and it just was never continued in a systematic way. These are long lead items that have to be tested, and over and over again, and more creative ways of doing it. And it just had a very unfortunate life.
Right.
The changes I saw were an increasing timidity on the part of both the political side and the executing side, implementing side, that has grown increasingly. And it is partly a fear of taking risk, but there's no doubt that the Cold War was a tremendous, and the space race was a tremendous stimulation to doing that. And I cannot believe that the Chinese going there isn't going to do the same thing, have the same effect. Can we get our act together quick enough, like we did then? I doubt it. The will might be there, and it depends, whoever is. But we need to have the technology absolutely ready to go. I'll give you an example. When they redesigned the space station for the umpteenth time, in 1993, there was the last redesign before we actually designed what's up there. They invited a whole bunch of Russians. And the Russians came, I think it may have been even my first day at headquarters, NASA headquarters. And so I went to see what was going on. I was invited. And I knew some of the Russians. I'd come across them before. And there were all these people talking about what we needed to do and how we needed to design and what we needed, this and that. And after we had heard all these engineers talk about it, one of the old crusty Russians stood up and said, "I don't understand." It was all through interpreter. And he said, "Well, what don't you understand?" "Well," he said, "does such and such work?" I said, "Yes." "Well, why are we changing it? Why are you changing it?" They were genuinely perplexed. It wasn't a criticism. They just could not fathom that if you've got something that works, you're going to change it. You're going to tweak it. And it was that mentality that, look at the Soyuz. How old is it? They don't get rid of something that works. And that has enabled them to stay on doing what they're doing and surfacing with a new kind of leadership. And we don't have that. We tweak. We're gadgeteers. We have to invent something new, test it. And yes, it can be wonderful, but it's costly, and you can't get on with it.
Yeah, what's the mission?
Exactly. The mission isn't just to tweak. And I think that's our problem. And it's partly our education. But you don't want me to go there.
No, go ahead.
Because, well, our education system, our college education has changed, has evolved, whatever.
Devolved?
Devolved. And I've seen it in medical school, where we went from anatomy on cadavers, with gradually fewer cadavers, experiments in rabbits or whatever. And I don't know what your affiliations with the animal world are, but I don't like doing experiments on animals any more than that. But they had an opportunity. Medical students had an opportunity to dissect, to learn, to see, whatever. to then visual demonstrations or demonstrations where you had one rabbit instead of everybody having a rabbit. So you consolidated, which is okay. Then you had some televised demonstration of what you're doing and the anatomy. And eventually you have a computerized program, which is how you learn. So that the first time a medical student now touches a real live body is when they graduate and they go into the internship or the emergency room. Comforting thought. On the engineering side, I had no idea, that. So I was always concerned because I taught medical students. I had seen that progression. I was doing a study at Ames in Northern California, and some colleagues from the Kennedy Space Center, who very good electronic tools and engineers, came to work with us. And there was one young fellow who had graduated, very bright, very creative. How they're measuring muscle contractions and whatever. And he was telling me, I was telling him this story about the medical students, and he was telling me, he says the same thing in engineering. So I said, what do you mean? He said, when I graduated from the University of Tennessee, I went to the Kennedy Space Center, and I was asked by my boss to design a recording unit for muscle activity. So I designed this unit, and I took it down to the shop. In those days we had a shop. And this crusty old guy looked at it and said, he said, I told him what I wanted done, and he said, fine, I'll call you. And he said, I started walking out of the room, and I heard this funny sound. I turned around, and he had just crumpled the paper and thrown it in the garbage can. And so I went right up to him, what are you doing? I worked, what are you doing? He said, so he picked it out and spread it out. He said, young man, if you can solder all these wires you've put there on one point, I will build it for you. And I'll never forget that story, because basically he said, I learned that what we do learn in engineering school is to do the plans and to write reports. We don't actually take what we propose and make it. And I think, I hate to say it, this was almost 20 years ago. So you can imagine what's happening now. The 3 students from San Francisco State that helped me build a human-powered centrifuge had an opportunity to actually cut metal and make something. But most of them don't. And what we have in a lot of the NASA young folks that are coming in, they're very bright. They're very bright, no doubt about it. But they make the right reports. They have meetings, and they do make plans. But they cannot translate them into products. And that, I'm sure there are some kids that can, somehow, somewhere, and I'm not trying to be judgmental of everybody, but it's not their fault. It's the process of education.
Right.
And this is what we have to snap out of to advance. I did not care for the Constellation because, and I've talked with others here, and I understand the logic of how it was designed and why it was designed. It was designed to take humans and employees who knew how to work on the shuttle, and therefore the design was based on being an evolution of the shuttle. I would take the Saturn, bring back
Saturn V?
Bring back the Saturn. Do the Russian thing. It worked, right?
Yeah.
So what's wrong with it? You know, why do an imitation? Bring it back.
Right, sure.
I mean, I know where there are some lying around that haven't been used. Bring it back.
Right.
Be humble. Doesn't matter. You know, what's the world going to say? Oh, you're using the shuttle. You're not.
Bring it back and go back to the moon.
Bring it back and go back to the moon. It's proven.
Yeah.
We did it. How come we can't do it umpteen years later?
Right.
That's the shame. That is a crime.
That's great.
That's all the problem right there.
Yeah, that's all the problem right there.